This is music throughout history, and we are focusing on the West. So for example, Africa and Asia has its own very rich cultural heritage, but that's way too much for us to cover, so that's why we're going to focus on where we are right now, meaning the West. This is an extremely old flute. It's 35,000 years old. It's probably made from mammoth bone, and it's the oldest instrument we know of. So it's the oldest instrument we can date archaeologically. But there might have been some hollow trees or stones that could be used as drums, but that's very hard to verify. Also, keep in mind that the first expression of music was probably singing, but of course we don't have any archaeological evidence of this. But what we do have are the Hurrian songs. This is the oldest preserved bit of musical notes. It's from around 1400 BCE, meaning 3400 years old. And it's from a place in what is now Syria. Please pay attention to the fact that these notes are not the notes we are used to, the ones with 5 lines and dots around. Because our way of writing music is fairly modern and also fairly specific to the West. We move on to the Middle Ages. This is a period that lasted for 1,000 years approximately, from the 5th century all the way to the 15th. And the Catholic Church had a huge empire, and they wanted to make sure that the same songs were being sung all throughout the empire, regardless of which country the church in question was. This meant that you could hear the same songs in, for example, Spain, Italy, and Germany, and therefore the empire had a chance to make sure that their version of Christianity was the one being taught in the churches. And also what they did was they wrote down the songs, the lyrics, the notes, they sent it out throughout the empire, and since the songs were all in Latin, you didn't need to translate anything. Nowadays in Sweden you can see something similar with Psalmboken, which is a collection of hymns that are sung all throughout the country in different Protestant churches. So you can go to different Protestant churches in different places in Sweden and see the same book and hear the same songs. We have both sacred, meaning having to do with God or religion. You have music like that with Leonin and his Christmas compositions. And if you hear this, you might hear that it sounds a bit like what a priest does in the Church of Sweden, where he sing-talks different parts. But you also have profane, meaning worldly, or not having to do with religion, with Demonchon. And here you can hear something very interesting. This is the first time in the West that people started to sing different parts altogether. So people weren't singing the same thing anymore, but one person could sing one melody while the other one was singing a different one. So this, in other words, was the birthplace of choir music. Another important development during this time was the ability to travel and trade with different cultures. It was now possible to go to the Middle East and buy things that aren't available in Europe, and with that came cultural influences. So people who traveled there saw their music and brought some home with them. An example of this, close connection to the Middle East is the instrument oud and the Western lute. So the lute is European, but it looks quite similar to the oud, and they are both examples of an early guitar. Before we head on to the Baroque period, we have the Renaissance, which I'm just going to mention shortly. Around this time they thought that the ancient Greek culture was the best. For example, when it came to architecture and art. So that's why you can see buildings that were built during the Renaissance and see that they are quite similar to the ones you might see in Greece, especially if you take a look at very, very old buildings. And during this time, a special type of songs called madrigals were written. These are profane songs that could be sung by choirs, and Växjö has its own magical choir, in which I sing and am the chairman of the board. Right, but now on to the Baroque period. This lasted from around 1600 to 1750, and the church was still strong, and music often had a religious meaning behind it. An example is Handel's Messiah. Oh no, sorry, Handel's Hallelujah Choir. Pardon me. Where they sing Hallelujah over and over again, and then some other things regarding God. So of course, that's quite religious. But profane, the worldly music, was getting stronger and stronger with both instrumental music, meaning not having lyrics, with Bach and his toccata and fugue in D minor. And you also have operas, like the ones Monteverdi wrote. Operas are based on the idea of Greek plays, but with music added onto it. So a story could now be told through acting, choreography, like movement and dance, and music, just like a musical. And the style of music often contained this style of music during the Baroque period often contained ornaments, meaning you add notes to a melody and play them very shortly. So, for example, if a person during this time were to write this note, da, they might say, alright, that's a bit boring. We're going to add an ornament. We're going to add a short note just above it and a short note just below it. Da, 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 and play it quickly. Da, da, da. And that might be an ornament. So this is why music from this time contains so many notes. Apart from this, there were also a huge development of instruments. It doesn't mean that these instruments were invented during the Baroque period, but they got their shape, their current shape. They got it from the Baroque period. So the violin actually started during this time to look like a violin, and a pipe organ started to look like a pipe organ. But what we do not have are castrato singers, because that is not allowed today. It is outlawed. This is where young boys were prevented from entering puberty, so their voices never broke in the way that most people with XY chromosomes do. Now for the classical era, this was during the 18th century, which is at the same time as the Enlightenment. Here during the Enlightenment, the church was challenged, and people wanted to think for themselves and figure things out with science, instead of reading it in the Bible or listening to what some priest had to say. Much in the same way, the music also should be more straightforward, without unclear melodies. And that is why much of the music from this time is fairly easy to whistle or sing. In Swedish, this period is called Wienklassicism, or Vienna classical music. And that is because many important composers worked in Vienna. Here, the symphonic orchestra became standardized, so it got its shape and form that we see today. So if you take a look at a symphonic orchestra, you're going to see different instruments in it. And the instruments used are virtually the same for every piece being played. And also where they are seated. That is also the same regardless of what music you hear. So you might see the violins to the left at the front, and behind them a bit further up you're going to see woodwinds, and to the right you might see cellos and contrabasses. That layout was developed and standardized during this time period. Before this era, music was bought by churches and the very rich and powerful, but now more people could take part of classical music, which made it possible for composers to work without having a church or a powerful person to pay them. Also, the pieces of music didn't have to be about what the church or the powerful people wanted the music to be about, and it was a more free time for composers. They could basically write the music they wanted to write. Romanticism. This lasted from around 1800 to 1900. Just as the Enlightenment was a reaction to and a protest against the Church, Romanticism protested against the Enlightenment's lack of emphasis on feelings. Now feelings and imagination was more important than science, which can be noticed in the very dramatic pieces of a composer like Richard Wagner, for example. But religious imagery was still very strong. You have, for example, Mahler's Second Symphony, which is called The Resurrection, which is about the resurrection of Jesus. Now, it doesn't mean that Mahler was trying to make sure everyone was Christian or trying to spread the word of Christianity. Instead, it might have been just that he wanted to write about something everyone already knew about. Write about a story everyone had heard before. And that is because music gets another dimension if you know what it's about. A more current example is Martin Luther King Jr., who fought for the rights of African Americans during the 20th century and the American Civil Rights Movement. He used a lot of biblical stories in his speeches. For example, the story about the Jews escaping slavery from Egypt. Now, this might be because he was a pastor, so of course, those are the kinds of stories he would tell. But it's also something everyone could relate to, because they've heard the story before. Nowadays we have something similar, where a lot of music is about love or hate or sorrow or happiness and so on, because these are things most of us could relate to. We also have nationalism that grew quite a lot during this time. Nationalism is the idea that you should celebrate one's own country's history, culture, language, and so on. And this was combined with Romanticism, which gave us Romantic nationalism. So you could, for example, in your musical compositions, use instruments or melodies that were particular to one's own country in your compositions. This example is Bedřich Smetana, who wrote the piece Moldo, And Moldo is a river that flows through his country of birth, the Czech Republic. Here you can hear instruments playing the sounds of that river. And you can hear when it turns from a small creek into the big Moldo River. Nationalism is still a popular idea with the Sweden Democrats, for example. And you can see it quite a lot in their politics and the way they act. And a typical way of promoting, let's say, Swedish culture is to bring out our folk music and to wear the traditional Swedish clothes. The last era is modern music, also called contemporary classical music. This started at the beginning of the 20th century and continues today. And the boundaries of what you can do with music is being tested more and more. So you take a look at music, you see what rules have been created of what you need to do in order to create quote unquote good music. And then try to break those rules. Arnold Schoenberg did this by creating his 12-tone system, which is basically a bunch of other rules which forces the composer to break free from ideas of what a melody should be. One rule is that you take the 12 notes in the scale, or the chromatic scale. So in Western culture, you normally have 12 notes in an octave, meaning you go from A all the way to G sharp, and then you've played 12 notes, and then it starts over again with A again. In his system, if you played an A, you need to make sure you play all the 11 other notes before you can play that A again. Another example is Jærklartach, and I do not know about the pronunciation. He is a composer that actually is alive today. He was born in 85, and if you take a listen to it, you can hear what a lot of modern music sound today. Here you hear instruments being used in ways they normally aren't, and you can see that the rules are being broken more and more. The last example is John Cage, who did a lot of things, but the example here is his 4 minutes and 33 seconds. This is a piece of music where the instrumentalists play nothing. So the only sound you hear are the sounds from the audience, or the speaker system, or the air conditioning, and so on. Could this be called music? Why or why not? And have you heard of an older person who says that today's music is just noise? Could it be that it's simply a question of what you're used to? And what boundaries exist today? What can we protest against in the way that the Enlightenment people spoke up against the church, or the people in the Romantic era criticized the Enlightenment? Well, there are some types of heavy metal that protests against religion, and some types of rap that protests against the police system, just to give two examples.